And if you don't have a handout, that's okay. Everything will be up on the overhead except for some detailed music theory analysis stuff, which this isn't really the crowd for anyway. What if the Ring cycle's notoriously convoluted stream of consciousness exposition of prose and music, an amorphous wash of signification resisting an easily discerned organization, could be snapped into place through the application of a master signifier? This would imply that learning the work is a process of familiarizing oneself with a fundamental thematic underpinning. But what if there were multiple potential master signifiers, each focusing different but overlapping or non-overlapping sets of ostensibly unrelated themes into perceptible patterns? More intriguing possibilities emerge. First, any reading of the cycle is only a function of an active master signifier. Second, the aggregate of all possible master signifiers circumscribes an equally large set of diverse, potentially contradictory readings. We have seen readings based on several such signifiers this weekend. Simon Williams's hermeneutic resulted from an engagement with the signifier nature, while Thomas Gray problematized environmentalist narratives by placing them in counterpoint with the signifier anarchy. Yesterday's afternoon session, and today's, centered on the signifier gender, and Alex Ross's keynote address was girded by the signifier race, a central Wagnerian keyword employed somewhat outside its most characteristic context, but which found such articulation in yesterday evening's paper session and film screening. In this paper, I propose that the master signifier marriage crystallizes a familiar but as yet unnoticed organizational pattern in the tetralogy. Classicist Mary Douglas describes ring composition as an ancient formal construction for stories and poetry that had long gone unrecognized, and that a lack of understanding of the cyclic nature of the form caused readers to consider ancient texts difficult, whereas their contemporary audiences would have experienced little trouble understanding them. According to Douglas, a well-formed ring composition will include the following features, reproduced as Figure 1. A prologue, a division into two halves, parallel, mirrored sections, repeated indicators or keywords that articulate the relationship between mirrored sections, an emphasized midpoint, which is usually developed at length and parallels the prologue, smaller rings within rings, which embed the large-scale structure into the constituent parts, and a latch connecting the end of the story back to the prologue. Key events pertaining to the primary marriages of the ring can be organized into the ring composition seen in Figure 2. Now, in each of my ring diagrams, the chronology of events will begin at the top of the diagram, run down the left side, across the bottom, then back up the right. Each moment on the right half of the ring structure serves as a repetition of the corresponding moment on the left half. This diagram includes two balanced sets of chiasmi, in which the later events do not exactly reverse the order of the original ones, and two rings within rings, labeled bands 5 and 6 on the diagram. Today's discussion will focus primarily on these two bands and position Siegfried and Brünnhilde's marriage as a perfection or a completion through repetition of that of Siegmund and Sieglinde. In her discussion of Lawrence Stern's Tristram Shandy, Douglas takes the position that ring composition can sensibly organize a voluminous and meandering story. Therefore, in Stern's case, it likely originated ad hoc, quote, as a structure in the mind of a brilliant author without his necessarily being aware of all the details of Hebrew poetic structures or meaning to adopt them. Wishing very much to avoid a conversation today as to whether Wagner consciously modeled his chef-d'oeuvre on the patterns of Hebraic poetry, I'll take the easy way out and simply suggest that the cycle's well-known genesis, in which Wagner first penned the librettos, mostly in reverse, and then composed the music chronologically, could contribute to a cyclic structure, shown as in Figure 3. This, of course, sidesteps the generative possibility so naive and obvious that it is almost embarrassing to actually articulate it, which is to note that Wagner, after all, composed a ring cycle. This perfection and completion through repetition carries an intended psychoanalytic flavor, and in a manner resembling Jacques Lacan's analysis of the Edgar Allan Poe story, The Purloined Letter, the marriage between Siegfried and Brünnhilde repeats and perfects that of Siegmund and Sieglinde by replicating but rearranging the nodes or arrows of their earlier arrangement. Here's a well-known example of the process, which corresponds to Band 7 of Figure 2. In Act 3 of Siegfried, the hero shatters Wotan's spear with the reforged Nothung in a gesture that recalls Siegmund's death in Act 2 of Die Walküre, when Wotan used the power of his spear to shatter Nothung. The parallels between these two moments abound. First, the exclamations use the same keywords, or Douglas's indicators. In the former, Zurück vor dem Speer in Stücken das Schwert, while in the later, Schwing deinen Speer, in Stücken spalt ich mein Schwert. So Speer, Stücken, and Schwert all feature as the keywords in the Stabreim. Both scenes feature a visual clash between sword and spear, and they also feature a musical clash between the spear and sword motives on the same F-sharp fully diminished 7th chord. See example 1. In Die Walküre, the passage begins with an interruption of the B minor Walküre motive by Wotan's entrance, which is punctuated by the fully diminished 7th chord. The sword motive immediately follows in C minor, a modal distortion representing the brokenness of the object, and the music leads to the enunciation of death motive. In Siegfried, the sword motive now correctly arpeggiates C major, and once again it strikes the spear against an F-sharp fully diminished 7th chord. This time, the sword is victorious, and as Matthew Bribitzer-Stull drew our attention to yesterday, now it is the spear motive that is distorted, descending with chromatic notes that obscure a tonal center, eventually landing on A, and now the music transitions to the Twilight of the Gods motive. Yet the musical and visual similarities of the two passages give way to an even deeper symbolism that drives to the root of one of the central ethical debates of the entire ring cycle, which is summarized and distilled by the love triangle diagrams in Figure 4. A spear is not just Wotan's weapon, it is a symbol for his rule of law through contract. The sword is not just Siegmund's or Siegfried's weapon, it is a phallic symbol of their virility and their capability for the transcendent love that the cycle presents as its ideal. And so when Wotan uses the power of the spear to destroy the sword in Die Walküre, he highlights what has been a prevailing ethic throughout the story up to that point, the rule of law as established through contract. In this case, Sieglinde's forced wedding oath, though clearly made under duress, trumps her genuine love and passion for Siegmund. By destroying Wotan's spear, Siegfried creates the very possibility for his love relationship with Brünnhilde, which is unable to be broken even when she is forced to make her own wedding contract to Günther. Bands 5 and 6 of Figure 2, this paper's titular wedding bands, correlate the two love marriages. Act 1 of Die Walküre begins in Medias Res. The love between Siegmund and Sieglinde sparks immediately and develops over the course of the act. The ordering of the events with that development create the ring within a ring outlined in Figure 5, which corresponds to the left side of Band 6 of Figure 2. The events on the right side of the diagram balance those on the left quite nicely. Although it does not include every event, the formed diagram tracks Act 1 from beginning to end. Scenes 1 and 2 constitute the first half of the cycle, whereas Scene 3 constitutes its second half. The most notable feature of the second half is a turn from minor to major. Many of the pairings feature relative and parallel mode relationships. For example, Hunding mocks Siegmund for being unarmed in C minor, anticipating the move to C major when Siegmund notices the glint of Nothung's hilt. Similarly, Siegmund names himself Weywald in D minor at the beginning of the act, and when Sieglinde finally calls him Siegmund at the end, she does so in its parallel major. Siegmund's tale and its repetition in Sieglinde are of critical importance in the structural development of their love. Siegmund's story is introduced by a motive first associated with his initial sympathy with Sieglinde, and a line of prologue follows in which he offers 3 possible names for himself, 2 he rejects, and 1 he accepts. Each name is suggested in its own local key area: Friedmund in C minor, Frohwald in B flat major, and Weywald in G minor. And the prologue ends with a 9/8 suspension. Example 2 includes the story's framing motive and its prologue, And example 3, which you may study at your leisure, provides harmonic analyses of each of the baselines of the 3 parts of the story, plus the epilogue. A gloss of Siegmund's narration appears across the staves. The story's prologue is a formal device that abbreviates the tripartite tale to come, each part of which is governed by its own local key center and punctuated with a self-identification. As part 1 ends, Siegmund identifies himself as a Wülfing. As part 2 ends, he says that his story explains why he must call himself Wewald. And the final identification comes in the epilogue to the story, which repeats the framing motive that began the introduction, and his final line leads to a cadence ending with a 9/8 appoggiatura, just as his prologue did. The tonal centers of each of the 3 parts of the story restate in reverse the ground presented by the prologue, which had moved from C minor to B flat major to G minor, now beginning in G minor, moving through A minor, and ending in C minor. The space of Siegmund's story may be diagrammed as in figure 6, a ring within the ring of figure 5, itself a ring within the ring of figure 2. The prologue is represented by the semicircle at the top and along the left side, and the right side constitutes parts 1 through 3 of the story. The surprising appearance of the Valhalla motive and the key of E major during part 2 juts out of the side of the diagram as the music makes an unexpected modulation to the dominant of A minor. Finally, the framing motive and the 9/8 motion at the cadences of Siegmund's first and last lines provide the latch, bringing the structure back to where it began. Sieglinde's story balances Siegmund's in the act's parallel structure, but is much briefer as it only narrates one event, Wotan's arrival during her wedding to Hunding. Example 4 represents a harmonic analysis of her tale. Again, you can study that at your leisure. Whereas Siegmund's story spanned a number of key areas, Sieglinde's story primarily centers on E as a tonic and simply shifts modality before ending in A minor. As in Siegmund's history, Sieglinde's tale also incorporates statements of the Valhalla motive, and these correspond to the turn from E minor to E major. A form diagram for Sieglinde's tale appears as figure 7 and emphasizes the appearances of the Valhalla motive to highlight their similarity to the one that appeared during Siegmund's tale. It's not immediately obvious what might constitute a governing key area for the act as a whole. Lawrence and other theorists have followed him by interpreting Acts 1 and 2 of Die Walküre as framing a complete unit in D minor, beginning with Siegmund's arrival at Hunding's hut and his death at Hunding's hand. But the turn to major for the second half of Act 1 and the amount of time it spends in keys of questionable relation to D minor makes it difficult to hear that as a governing tonality for the entire act. A more interesting possibility is that the act implies but does not conclusively establish C as a central tonic, as all of the key areas in the figure 5 have currency in C major minor, including the Neapolitan, and the multiple emphasized appearances of the sword motive in C further imbue the key area with a sense of yet unrealized potential. Not only is this reading contained within the abstract harmonic structure of the act, but it allows the G major with which the act ends to suggest a half cadence. There is not yet a resolution in C because that key will represent the unborn Siegfried and will participate as one member of an E-C tonal pairing that will underpin his marriage to Brünnhilde. Thinking about the harmonic structure of Act 1 as somehow pointing toward a C yet to come adds an additional interpretive wrinkle to figures 6 and 7. In this reading, the Valhalla motive does not just merely demarcate the point of union between the two stories or even their shared parentage, but also creates a point of sexual union, as it allows the two stories to nestle. And since Siegmund's story was framed by C minor and G minor, Sieglinde's central tonality of E completes the C major triad. The two stories thus contain, and through coupling, bring together the genetic code of their unborn son. After tasting the dragon's blood in Act 2 of Siegfried, the hero is surprised to learn that he can suddenly understand the song of the forest bird, who advises him that he may find a sleeping bride on a rock surrounded by fire. After crossing through the ring of flames, Siegfried discovers a sleeping warrior constricted by armor. Using the sword, he removes the armor to discover that the warrior is a woman, whom he awakens with a kiss. Brünnhilde, who had with Wotan intended that Siegfried be the hero to find her, is afraid to give herself to him completely but the hero convinces her to love him, and the opera ends with the couple in the throes of passion. Siegfried and Brünnhilde's story continues during the prelude of Götterdämmerung. The hero leaves the rock to seek further adventures, but gives to Brünnhilde the ring as a token of his love. She praises the gods for bringing her happiness, and they say farewell. Unfortunately, their story does not remain a happy one, and the events of Siegfried's second visit correspond with those of his first, but in reverse order. After drinking a potion of forgetfulness and learning from Günther that a sleeping woman surrounded by fire awaits a fearless hero, Siegfried sets off to abduct Brünnhilde on his new blood brother's behalf. Brünnhilde, seeing the flames surge, prepares to greet Siegfried, but meets a strange man claiming that he has won her as bride. Brünnhilde curses Wotan, believing she now understands the meaning of his punishment. Siegfried demands that Brünnhilde give him the ring as a dowry, and though she resists, she is eventually overpowered. Siegfried sends her to sleep, and as a symbol of his chaste wooing, places the sword between them for the duration of their bridal night. The events of Act 3 of Siegfried and the prelude of Act 1 of Götterdämmerung thus create another ring within a ring. Figure 8 corresponds to the right side of bands 5 and 6 on Figure 2. The left side of Figure 8 traces Brünnhilde's marriage to Siegfried and is balanced by the right side, Brünnhilde's forced marriage to Günther. But the complex logic of ring composition allows one element to serve both forward-looking and backward-looking ends. In the sub-ring just mentioned, Siegfried awakening Brünnhilde is a forward-looking structural event that is paired with his sending her to sleep in Götterdämmerung. But on a larger scale, Siegfried awakens Brünnhilde in fulfillment of a prophecy made during the event that it repeats in reverse, Wotan's punishment. The order of musical materials and the associated events that occur when Siegfried comes to Brünnhilde's rock are a reversal of the events and musical material that occurred when Wotan put Brünnhilde to sleep. The musical construction of the two passages can also thus be laid in a ring form, as in Figure 9. Because the passage in Siegfried is longer and also incorporates musical and dramatical themes that had not yet been developed in Die Walküre, I have labeled extraneous passages or unrelated passages simply as interludes. Otherwise, relevant motives are grouped into units and complexes. Complexes are groups that are within a single box, and they represent coherent passages that present motives serially or in alternation. Units are groups of motives composed in counterpoint, which therefore cannot be separated without destroying the musical texture. Braces in the diagram reflect such units. For example, the second box on the left-hand side indicates a unit wherein the sleeping Brünnhilde motive is heard in counterpoint with Wotan's farewell. By contrast, the box opposite indicates a complex wherein Wotan's farewell is heard first, and then subsequently the sleeping Brünnhilde is played. William Kinderman adapted Robert Bailey's theory of the double tonic complex to posit E and C as a tonal pairing in Act 3 of Siegfried and in Act 3 of Götterdämmerung. Kinderman argues that the scene leading up to and including Siegfried's death and funeral music is a large-scale recapitulation of his arrival on Brünnhilde's rock. Not only does Siegfried retell the narrative of the earlier scene, but the musical accompaniment repeats the earlier motivic material during the telling, and crucially, repeats the large-scale tonal motion from E to C, which is foreshadowed by the E minor, C major juxtaposition that occurs when Brünnhilde first awakes. This is example 6, which is on your last page. Kinderman's reading does not imply an equality between C and E, but hinges on E as a central tonality being superseded by C, where it comes to closure with Siegfried's death. But according to Bailey, a double tonic complex usually features two key centers related by third, and he highlights the importance of the fact that both tonics are granted equal importance. I have elsewhere amplified Kinderman's insightful reading of the E-C pair by arguing that Brünnhilde's immolation brings about closure for the key of E major, thereby affording it equal prominence. Here, I wish to argue that the pairing story began in that of Siegfried's parents, which pointed to, but did not yet articulate the key of C, and Wotan's farewell, which first connected Brünnhilde to E while implying and undermining C as a symbol for the absence of the hero who will eventually come to awaken her. This is why the key areas for Brünnhilde's punishment are labeled in Figure 9 as E and not C. As Wotan prepares to put Brünnhilde to sleep in a passage transcribed in example 5, the orchestra sounds the renunciation of love motive in E minor. A deceptive cadence shifts the local tonic to C as Wotan prepares to kiss her divinity away, but the passage, very poignantly, comes to a deceptive cadence on the A-flat major that begins the magic sleep cycle of major thirds through E major, C major, G sharp major, before coming to rest on E, where the passage began. Whereas Brünnhilde's awakening juxtaposes C and E as equals, her fall from godhood and into a magic sleep help establish E as her central tonality, while articulating a stunning avoidance of the other member of the tonal pairing. Today, I have suggested that the principle of ring composition can elucidate organizational patterns in Wagner's magnum opus that may otherwise be missed. Noticing that there seems to be a palindromic exposition of plot events can help alleviate that common Wagnerian frustration. How does one isolate and organize excerpts for study of a vast composition that purposefully resists segmentation? Moreover, like ripples in the Rhine, rings within rings, if you'll permit me the stop rhyme, reflect the similarity of certain embedded moments to the overall form, drawing our attention to the structural repetition of Siegmund and Sieglinde's marriage in that of Siegfried and Brünnhilde, and allowing us to further develop Kinderman's analysis of the tonal pairing into a full-fledged and long-standing tonal background. As I am slightly over my allotted time, I will close here, but will be happy to discuss figure 10, which is that tonal background, during the discussion, if there's interest. Thank you.
We do have a few minutes for questions.
Sorry, I'm the first. Thank you very much. This was, I was thrilled by all your observations, but let me allow to pose a question which may ask for the framework of all your observations. Because the ring form, as you defined it, has so many abstract features that it can be identified also in other forms. How are your observations related to Lorentz Bogen form, where the Bogen form is the ring form? And how do you, it seems that especially the Bogen form, or even the Bogen form can be also defined as two bars, two Stollen of a bar, because Lorentz is very free in composing Stollenabgesang. So these two parts you are defining as a mirroring form could also be a repetition. So isn't there a danger to get into a kind of kaleidoscope of forms where a special obsession in the end is dominant, where you see them everywhere?
Yeah, I think you raise a really good question. I avoided Bogen form because certainly it has certain weight carried with it right now, but also because Bogen form, it doesn't have the same specific features as a ring composition. It has that palindromic sense to it, but it doesn't have the other key features. It doesn't imply that there would be kind of an organized smaller ring within a bigger ring. It doesn't have the feature of the central place, which Mary Douglas talks about, and it doesn't have the latch is the other main feature. But that doesn't, I think, address your main point, which is, am I looking for things here which aren't there, but this is sort of a fanciful view of the ring? And it very well may be. I had a lot of fun putting this together. The framework that I'm coming from in the largest form is that this is not intended to be a structure which defines what the ring is. That now that I've found the geheimness of the ring composition in the ring structure, we can all be done and not talk about form. We can not talk about theme anymore. Rather, I see this more as one of a myriad of possibilities. And you'll forgive me. I've been watching Carl Sagan lately, and he has the image of the sphere that comes into flatland and annoys all the flatlanders because all they can see is this circle that appears in their house without being able to see the whole 3 dimensions of it. So I kind of view this analysis as being kind of one cross-section of this enormous 3-dimensional object, which kind of caught my interest. And I'm curious to see what could happen if you move that sphere ever so slightly, a different ring perhaps, or a different form entirely will emerge if you, instead of using the term marriage, you would use the term race, which may be going, or gender, or environmentalism, which we saw the other day. So I take your question to heart, and if you'll allow me to say I'm not articulating this as the be-all and the end-all, but more of a fantasia on an idea.
One more question.
Thank you for your presentation. I found this ring idea, at least of the plot elements, to be something worth thinking about. Christian beat me to the punch about Bogen form. So that's the obvious formal paradigm when we're talking about thematic and key relationships that's at least suggested by the diagrams that you've got here. And modern-day scholars seem to have really gotten away from readings of form that follow some sort of palindromic arrangement. And I wanted to ask you, even though it's not the same thing that you're talking about here in terms of a ring structure, another kind of musical circularity that seems to be gaining popularity in formal analysis in Wagner, and that is this idea of rotational form. Mm-hmm. So if you're familiar with Warren Darcy's analysis of the end of the ring, or Graham Hunt's analysis of the end of Act 1 of Götterdämmerung, or even Lawrence's analysis of the end of Act 2 is something of a rotational principle. Do you think that has any validity in terms of the idea of invoking a ring metaphor?
Yeah, you reminded me of something else, which is to say that what I've talked about here is not an uninterrupted span of music, right? So I'm not looking to put a formal structure to one long passage of music that's undivided, which is another approach to form, which is what happens in rotational form and in Bogen form. So I'm actually teasing out a thread which might come out above the surface and then go under the surface while we deal with Siegfried's youth and things of that nature, and then come out later. So that's one difference. I also don't think that rotational form has the It doesn't seem to have a ring shape, except for the fact that it kind of comes back to the beginning again, as much as it does the sense of the repetition. So I did talk about the Lacanian repetition and completion. You can get that in a rotational form, but not I don't, unless I'm mistaken, see there being some kind of a palindromic structure to them as well.
Yeah, no, there isn't. I think it's another kind of circular metaphor we're talking about.
Yeah.
All right, thank you very much.